A dinner by candlelight, and one guest never made it home. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Rvela. This mystery-loving community is amazing. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments light up every story. Let's begin. It was a tranquil autumn evening in the village of St. Mildred's. The last of the golden leaves fluttered across the cobbled high street, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from the chimneys of tidy cottages. From the vicarage to the post office, life moved at its usual unhurried pace, save for one matter that had set every tongue wagging: the long-awaited candlelight dinner at the grand house of Mr. and Mrs. Harcourt. The Harcourts were newcomers, having purchased Elmwood Manor just 6 months prior. It was said that Mr. Harcourt had done something in banking, while Mrs. Harcourt, a handsome woman of 40 with a quick smile and quicker temper, was intent on becoming the social centrepiece of St. Mildred's. Her dinner party, scheduled for Saturday evening, was to be the event of the season. A small, intimate gathering, as she told everyone, of only the most charming and respectable sort. Miss Jane Marple, from her thatched cottage on the edge of the village, had received an invitation as well, written in elegant blue ink and signed with an emphatic flourish, to lend an air of refinement. Mrs. Harcourt had remarked rather audibly at the grocer's. Miss Marple had accepted, of course. She always found that dinners, especially those organised by ambitious hostesses, revealed a great deal about human nature. That Saturday, the guests assembled in Elmwood Manor's oak-panelled drawing-room. The fire crackled cheerfully, and the crystal chandeliers shimmered in the candlelight. Among the invitees were Colonel Geoffrey Somers, a retired military man with a booming voice and a fondness for port; Mrs. Emily Fenton, the village's widow of means, whose sharp tongue was only matched by her sharper curiosity; Dr. Lionel Reed, a young physician recently settled in St. Mildred's, whose calm manner had already made him quite popular; Mr. Charles Denham, a London art dealer of smooth manners and uncertain reputation; Miss Marple, quietly knitting in the corner, her blue eyes missing nothing. Dinner was served in the long dining hall, lit only by the glow of candelabras. The conversation flowed lightly. Gossip about the vicar's new sermon, the price of butter, and Mrs. Harcourt's rumoured French chef. But beneath the polite laughter, there was a tension so faint it might have gone unnoticed, save by Miss Marple, who saw everything. It was during the second course, roast, pheasant with cranberry glaze, that the first discord arose. Mrs. Harcourt had just lifted her glass when Mr. Denham made a remark about business arrangements gone awry. The comment was too casual, too pointed, and Mr. Harcourt's hand trembled slightly as he poured the wine. Moments later, the laughter resumed, but Miss Marple noted the glance that passed between the couple, one of quiet reproach and embarrassment. By dessert, a pale lemon soufflé, the unease had grown. Mr. Harcourt appeared withdrawn, Mrs. Harcourt overly bright. Dr. Reed, sitting opposite them, seemed aware of it too. When the servants withdrew, a chill gust blew through the slightly open French doors, flickering the candles and plunging one corner of the table into shadow. Then came a sound, soft at first, then unmistakable. A glass shattered. A chair scraped sharply against the floor. Mrs. Harcourt stood frozen, her hand to her mouth. Mr. Harcourt lay slumped over his plate, his face ghostly pale, his eyes unseeing. For a moment no one moved. Then the Colonel barked, "Good Lord, man's fainted!" and rushed forward. But it was Miss Marple who rose quietly, her expression grave. "No, Colonel," she said softly, after one brief glance. "I'm afraid it's rather worse than that. The candles flickered again. The village of St. Mildred's would never be quite so peaceful again. Would you like me to continue with part 2? 2. The village reacts, where gossip, speculation, and secrets begin to swirl through St. Mildred's the following morning. Morning in St. Mildred's arrived grey and subdued, the mist curling through the hedgerows and settling over the rooftops like a soft morning veil. The church bell tolled 9, slow and resonant, and already the village was humming with whispers. By the time Miss Hartley opened her bakery shutters, 3 separate versions of the previous night's tragedy were circulating, each more extravagant than the last. One had Mr. Harcourt struck down by a mysterious foreign poison. Another claimed he had choked upon a fishbone. A third, more dramatic still, suggested suicide brought on by disgrace. Miss Marple, however, sipping her morning tea by the parlour window, was quite certain it was none of those things. Her instincts, tempered by years of quiet observation, told her that this was murder of a most deliberate sort. At 10 o'clock, a knock came upon her door. Sharp, official, and entirely expected. Detective Inspector Craden stood upon the threshold, his coat collar damp with mist. He was a solid man with kind eyes that betrayed the strain of early retirement postponed by rural emergencies. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I wonder if you'd be good enough to tell me precisely what you saw last night." She ushered him in with the faintest smile, as though she had been expecting an old friend for tea, rather than a policeman about a corpse. "Do sit down, Inspector. You'll forgive me, I hope, for saying that you look in need of something warm." Craden accepted the cup she offered, glanced about the neatly ordered room, and waited. Miss Marple spoke without embellishment. Mr. Harcourt was in good health when we sat down. He ate sparingly, though Mrs. Harcourt pressed him to take more. He appeared distracted, perhaps troubled. The conversation turned, unfortunately, to matters of business, and Mr. Denham made a remark that seemed to sting. Thereafter I noticed Mr. Harcourt drank little of his wine, and yet he was the first to falter. The inspector jotted notes with a dull pencil, and no quarrel, no sudden upset, none that would be obvious to anyone less observant, she said mildly. But Mrs. Harcourt's reaction was peculiar. She screamed yes, but rather too late, almost as though she had been waiting to see whether he would truly fall. Craden frowned. "You think she expected it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think she feared it, or something like it." She paused, letting the notion settle. There was also the wine decanter, a fine-cut crystal piece, recently filled. Mr. Denham poured from it, then passed it on. I noticed Mrs. Harcourt refused her share, remarking she'd taken enough already. Curious, don't you find? By noon, the inspector had interviewed each guest. Colonel Summers swore on his military honour that he'd seen nothing amiss. Mrs. Fenton was sure she'd heard a faint clink before the glass shattered. Dr. Reed confessed that by the time he reached the victim, life was quite gone. The cause, he ventured, was some form of acute cardiac failure, though whether induced naturally or otherwise, he could not yet say. Only Miss Marple's testimony carried that calm precision which the inspector trusted more than any medical theory. When she stepped into the village later that afternoon, the gossip was in full chorus. Outside the post office, Mrs. Price was holding forth on the wickedness of wealth, while young Tommy Reeves darted between doorways, delivering newspapers that shouted, "Banker's sudden death at Elmwood Manor." Miss Marple listened quietly, asked after the weather, and went about her errands. Yet behind her gentle inquiries, her mind moved briskly, fitting each new scrap of information into its proper place. From the grocer, she learned that Mrs. Harcourt had ordered a fresh bottle of imported claret 2 days prior. unusual, since the household cellar was well stocked. From the postmistress came word of a letter addressed to Mr. Harcourt marked private and urgent, arriving the very morning of the dinner, and from the vicar's wife, who knew everything worth knowing. Miss Marple discovered that Mrs. Harcourt had once been engaged to none other than Mr. Denham, the art dealer. Broke it off rather suddenly, the vicar's wife confided, something about his dealings being questionable. Miss Marple merely nodded, her eyes bright with thought. That evening the fog deepened, and with it the sense of unease. The inspector returned to Elmwood Manor, lantern in hand, to oversee the removal of the body. Miss Marple, standing at her garden gate, watched the carriage pass. She thought of Mr. Harcourt's trembling hand, of the decanter glittering beneath candlelight, of Mrs. Harcourt's delayed cry. There was purpose in all of it, she felt, but the pattern had not yet shown itself. Human nature seldom changed. It only concealed itself behind manners and candlelight. The next morning brought the coroner's preliminary finding. Traces of digitalis were present in the glass beside the victim's plate, a deadly poison easily obtained from foxglove leaves, abundant in every village garden. The discovery sent fresh tremors through St. Mildred's. At the tea-room, speculation turned savage. Mrs. Fenton insisted it must be Mrs. Harcourt. Jealousy or inheritance, she said, were the only motives fit for such crimes. The Colonel defended the widow stoutly. Too stoutly, Miss Marple thought, recalling how the old soldier's gallantry often masked his loneliness. Dr. Reed, meanwhile, was the picture of modest distress. "Terrible business," he murmured, "and to think it happened under my very nose." Yet, when Miss Marple asked how he'd come so promptly to the dinner that night, since his surgery usually kept him late, he hesitated almost imperceptibly, before replying that Mrs. Harcourt had sent a note earlier in the day, requesting his attendance for an old patient's nerves. It was the kind of small inconsistency Miss Marple treasured. She spent the afternoon in her garden, pruning roses while her mind pruned away false leads. Poison implied calculation, not passion. Whoever had administered it must have known Mr. Harcourt's habits, his preference for certain wines, his tendency to sip rather than drink deeply. And if Mrs. Harcourt had truly feared what might happen, why invite witnesses at all? No, there was something else, something older and more secret at the root of this. At dusk she took a quiet walk past Elmwood Manor. The great house loomed behind its wrought-iron gates, its windows blank and dark. Near the servants' path she paused, hearing faint voices within. The widow's sharp tones and the inspector's steadier murmur. Words drifted through the chill air. Letter, debt, Denham. Miss Marple moved on, not wishing to eavesdrop yet storing every syllable in memory. Along the lane she met young Alice, the Harcourt's maid, tearful and red-eyed. "Oh, Miss Marple," the girl sobbed, "they're saying I filled the decanter, but I never touched it after cook corked it that morning, I swear." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand upon her arm. "Truth, my dear, has a way of rising, just as cream does. Keep your heart steady." And as the girl hurried off, Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Cook corked it that morning. Then who had uncorked it later? By the third day, Elmwood Manor was sealed pending further inquiry. The funeral arrangements had begun, though Mrs. Harcourt's mourning appeared more ostentatious than sorrowful. Black silk and lace displayed at every opportunity. Miss Marple observed her at the churchyard gates, receiving condolences with a composure almost theatrical. "So young to be a widow," someone murmured behind her, "and yet she doesn't look broken." Miss Marple said nothing, but her knitting needles clicked briskly that evening as she considered the widow's performance. Grief, in her long experience, rarely dressed so well. Late that night a soft knock sounded again at her door. This time it was Dr. Reed. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, looking pale and earnest. "Inspector Creighton told me you might have insights. There's something troubling me. During the dinner, I recall seeing Mr. Denham slip a small packet from his pocket. White paper, folded twice. I thought nothing of it then. Could that have been poison?" Miss Marple finished gently. "It could have been many things. Yet one must be careful not to see guilt simply because it is convenient." She watched him closely. "You're certain of what you saw?" He hesitated again, eyes shifting toward the door. "I believe so." And with that he excused himself hastily, leaving behind a faint scent of carbolic soap and anxiety. Miss Marple sat for a long while after he had gone, the clock ticking softly on the mantel. Bit by bit, the pieces were arranging themselves into a pattern. Business troubles, an old engagement, a falsified debt, a bottle ordered specially. Yet one question remained. Who had known about the letter delivered that morning? The one marked private and urgent. For whoever had seen it, or feared its contents, would have had the strongest reason to ensure Mr. Harcourt never read it aloud. The following dawn found her walking toward the post office, ostensibly to send a parcel of rose cuttings to her niece. But her purpose was quite another. Miss Griggs, the postmistress, was always ready for a friendly chat. "Terrible business, that," she sighed as she stamped the parcel. "And to think, the letter came registered. London postmark, heavy paper, the kind banks use." Mrs. Harcourt fetched it herself, just after breakfast. Said her husband was indisposed and she'd deliver it personally. Miss Marple's smile was faint but satisfied. The last piece, she felt, had fallen neatly into place. Murder, after all, was only a particularly unpleasant form of deceit, and deceit, as she well knew, never stayed buried for long beneath the quiet soil of St. Mildred's. By the time the afternoon sun had thinned the mist and laid soft gold upon the hedgerows, Miss Marple had reached a quiet certainty. Mrs. Harcourt had fetched that fatal letter and, for reasons of her own, ensured her husband would never read it. Yet certainty and proof were different matters, and Miss Marple, who had seen many seemingly clear cases turn awry through human frailty, resolved to proceed with patience. She spent the rest of that day in her garden, trimming the lavender, listening to the sparrows, and thinking about the strange way guilt so often expressed itself. Not in great dramatic gestures, but in small inconsistencies, slips of speech, and moments of overconfidence. It was in those moments, she knew, that truth revealed itself. When evening came, the village gathered again in its usual way, though conversation was now constrained by the shadow of death. The tea-room was quieter, the laughter brittle. Mrs. Fenton, who had appointed herself moral judge of the matter, was lamenting loudly that such things should occur in a Christian village. Colonel Summers, nursing his tea, protested that murder was never an Englishwoman's way, that Mrs. Harcourt was a flighty sort, but incapable of such villainy. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively by the window, listened as one listens to the wind rustling through leaves, each word a clue to temperament rather than fact. She noticed how Dr. Reed, seated a few tables away, kept glancing toward the door as though expecting someone. His nervousness, faint though it was, seemed to grow each time the bell above the door tinkled. A little before 6, Mrs. Harcourt herself appeared, dressed impeccably in black silk, with a small veil that trembled like a cobweb. Conversation froze. She paused at the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, then crossed directly to Dr. Reed's table. Their conversation, though hushed, carried fragments that reached Miss Marple's attentive ear. Words like arrangements, inspector, and denim. The doctor's tone was pleading, hers crisp, dismissive. Then, after a few tense minutes, Mrs. Harcourt rose, gave a curt nod, and swept out, leaving behind the faint scent of lilies. Dr. Reed remained seated, visibly troubled. After a while he rose and, noticing Miss Marple, hesitated before approaching. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said with forced brightness. "I trust you are keeping well?" She smiled serenely. "As well as can be expected, dear doctor, though I must confess, the village has rarely been so restless. These unfortunate occurrences unsettle even the most sensible." He nodded, ran a hand through his hair, and lowered his voice. "Between ourselves, the inspector suspects Mrs. Harcourt, but he's no firm proof. The coroner's report confirms the poison, yes, but not how it was administered. And she, well, she's clever. Keeps everything perfectly proper." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly against one another in her lap. "Yes, cleverness can be such a handicap, don't you think? It often makes people careless about the small, simple things." She looked up at him. "Tell me, doctor, have you ever found that deceit weighs differently upon the conscience than grief?" He stared uncertain, then murmured, "I suppose deceit must always leave a trace." "Quite so," she said gently, "and one must only know where to look for it." That night, while the rest of the village closed its shutters against the chill, Miss Marple took a slow walk to Elmwood Manor. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes. The great house stood silent now, its windows dark save for one flickering light, high in the west wing. She knew that was Mrs. Harcourt's room. The widow had refused to leave the house, claiming she must put her affairs in order. A curious phrase, Miss Marple thought, for someone whose husband had been dead less than a week. From behind the hedge she saw a shadow move past the lighted window. Then another, smaller one. A second person was there. She lingered a moment longer, then quietly withdrew. The next morning she called upon Inspector Craden, who looked weary and exasperated. Papers littered his desk. The decanter sat before him, sealed and tagged. "It's a tangle, Miss Marple," he said. "Everyone had some opportunity. The poison could have been introduced before dinner, but we can't prove who had access. Cook insists the bottle was sealed that morning. The maid swears she never touched it. Mrs. Harcourt claims she only opened it at table, but the cork shows signs of being withdrawn earlier. Denham's vanished to London, says he's attending business, though I'll wager he's dodging inquiry." Miss Marple's gaze rested thoughtfully on the decanter. "And yet," she said, "I wonder if we're not looking too closely at the wine. People so often fix their minds on what seems most obvious." The inspector frowned. "You think the poison wasn't in the wine?" "Oh, it might have been," she said lightly. "But we should remember that opportunity and intention rarely wear the same face. A clever murderer would want us to believe the poison came from the glass everyone saw. It's much tidier that way." That afternoon Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Harcourt under the pretext of sympathy. The widow received her in a drawing-room heavy with flowers and draped in dark velvet. She was pale but composed, her manner one of weary fortitude. "Such dreadful talk in the village," she sighed. "One would think I'd personally poured the poison myself." "People do chatter," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's the way small places work through tragedy. I remember when poor Mr. Lytton died of mushroom stew. Everyone was sure his wife had mixed it on purpose, and yet it was proved the maid had mistaken one fungus for another. We mustn't assume malice where ignorance might serve." Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened slightly. "Ignorance is a dangerous excuse. My husband's death was no accident." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "You were very devoted to him, I think." A pause followed, brittle and thin. "We had our differences," Mrs. Harcourt admitted at last. "But what couple does not?" While the widow poured tea, Miss Marple let her eyes wander. On the mantel lay a letter-knife, a silver frame containing the photograph of a young man in uniform, Mr. Harcourt clearly, and beside it a small porcelain figurine of a foxglove bloom. Such an odd ornament, she thought, for a woman mourning a death by digitalis. As Mrs. Harcourt handed her a cup, Miss Marple noticed the woman's fingers trembled just faintly, though her smile remained steady. "You must find this ordeal dreadful," Miss Marple said gently. "The interviews, the suspicion, the endless questions." "It is intolerable," Mrs. Harcourt said with a little shiver. "Inspector Craden was here again this morning. He asked about letters, whether my husband had any correspondence that might shed light on his affairs. I told him everything had been destroyed." "Destroyed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, curious. "Surely not so soon." "Oh, I could not bear to see them lying about," Mrs. Harcourt replied too quickly. "They reminded me of his absence." Miss Marple took her leave soon after, though her thoughts were busy as she walked back through the village lanes. Destroyed letters, a porcelain foxglove, a guest who vanished to London, all pieces of a puzzle whose edges were beginning to fit. But one question still troubled her. Why poison at a dinner party? If Mrs. Harcourt had wished to kill her husband, she might have done so privately, with far less risk, unless, of course, the dinner itself served another purpose. An alibi, perhaps, or a stage upon which someone else could act unnoticed. That evening she wrote a brief note to Inspector Craden, requesting he call on her in the morning. When he arrived, she showed him a small scrap of paper she had retrieved from her visit to Elmwood Manor, a half-burnt corner of a letter found in the fireplace. It bore the faintly legible words, "Settlement complete," and a London banking address. Craden's eyes widened. "So the letter did concern money," he said, "and Mrs. Harcourt destroyed it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, though I suspect she destroyed it to protect herself from scandal, not to hide murder. There's another hand in this, Inspector. Someone who knew of that settlement and feared exposure. Ask yourself who benefits most from Mr. Harcourt's death. The widow inherits, yes, but Denham's debts disappear, and Dr. Reed's involvement with Mrs. Harcourt, if rumour speaks true, would have ruined them both had the letter been made public." The inspector looked startled. "Reed and Mrs. Harcourt? Oh, it's only village talk," Miss Marple said lightly. "But such talk usually rests upon a pebble of truth. I believe the key lies with that decanter still. Have it examined not just for poison, but for tampering with the seal. And, if you please, find out precisely who ordered that particular bottle of claret. I fancy the trail will lead us somewhere most interesting." As the inspector departed, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the fading light. A cat moved across the garden wall, silent and precise. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. The village, outwardly calm once more, hid beneath its quiet surface the tangled roots of greed, jealousy, and deceit. And Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful and bright, knew the time was drawing near when those roots would break through the soil and show their true shape. The following morning broke with an unusual stillness, a kind of tense quiet that seemed to grip St. Mildred's in its pale fingers. The air was cold and still, the hedgerows rhymed with frost, and the sound of the milkman's cart echoed sharply down the lane. Miss Marple, already dressed and tidying her breakfast tray, watched from her window as Inspector Craden trudged toward her cottage once again, his expression carrying the faint weariness of a man whose thoughts had begun to chase themselves in circles. She had expected him. Indeed, she had set aside an extra cup and a fresh pot of tea, knowing instinctively that he would have something new to share. something that would nudge the delicate balance of their mystery just enough to expose its deeper pattern. Craden entered with a brisk nod, stamping the cold from his boots. "I took your advice, Miss Marple," he said before she could even offer the teapot. "Had the claret bottle examined in detail. You were right, the seal had been tampered with. Someone removed the cork earlier, then carefully pressed it back into place. What's more, there were faint traces of wax along the rim, none belonging to the original bottle." Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements precise and unhurried. "Then the poison was introduced well before dinner." "Likely that morning," he replied, "and whoever did it knew enough chemistry to measure a fatal dose. But here's the rub. We checked the order you mentioned. The wine was purchased not by Mrs. Harcourt, but by Mr. Denham through a London merchant. Delivered 2 days before the dinner, addressed to Elmwood Manor." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "That does alter the complexion of things. Tell me, did Mr. Denham offer any explanation for so generous a gesture?" "None yet," said Craden grimly. "He claims he sent it as a gift, some token of gratitude for their hospitality. Yet when we pressed him further, he grew evasive, insisted he'd had the wine stored for months, and only thought to send it along when Mrs. Harcourt invited him." "A curious coincidence," murmured Miss Marple, "that such an old acquaintance should suddenly become so thoughtful." She stirred her tea gently, the spoon chiming against the porcelain, and Mrs. Harcourt accepted the gift without suspicion. "So she says. Denham's signature was on the delivery note, but she never mentioned it until we confronted her." The inspector hesitated. "She insists her husband handled the wine himself, claims she merely arranged the table." People are often careless with the truth when fear begins to whisper, Miss Marple said softly. "Still, I wonder whether Mrs. Harcourt fears the right person. There are different kinds of terror, Inspector, some that come from guilt, and some from knowledge." Craden rubbed his chin. "We also found something else, though it's odd. The decanter stopper, under magnification, there were fingerprints. Not Mrs. Harcourt's, not the servant's, not Denham's either. We compared them with Dr. Reed's, and they match." He glanced up quickly, expecting surprise, but Miss Marple only nodded, as though the fact confirmed what she had quietly suspected all along. "Ah," she said, "the good doctor. Conscientious, well-spoken, admired by all. The village has placed him rather high upon a pedestal, hasn't it? And yet pedestals are such precarious things." Craden frowned. "You believe Reed had a hand in it?" "And I believe," she answered, "that Dr. Reed's virtues make him appear above suspicion, and such appearances are extremely useful to a murderer. But before we condemn the man, let us consider what might have driven him to it. Doctors, as you know, have access to poisons, and digitalis especially. Still, motive is the heart of any crime. What binds him to Mrs. Harcourt, beyond professional courtesy?" Craden sighed, lowering his voice. "We've uncovered that they corresponded privately. Notes passed through the maid. Nothing improper written, but enough to raise questions. And you were right about Denham, too. He and Mrs. Harcourt once shared more than friendship. According to one of her old acquaintances, the engagement ended when Mr. Harcourt discovered certain debts owed by Denham, debts he quietly paid to avoid scandal. If that London letter concerned a financial settlement, it could have meant ruin for Denham if Harcourt chose to reveal it." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said slowly, "the letter's arrival forced someone's hand. But which one? But which one?" But as the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained still for some moments, the rhythm of the clock marking her thoughts. She imagined the dinner once more, the polished table, the flickering candles, each guest seated precisely as if upon a stage. The poison introduced not by chance, but by opportunity. Who among them had known that Mr. Harcourt would drink first, or that Mrs. Harcourt would refuse her glass. That small detail lingered in her mind like a discordant note. She had learned long ago that in human affairs, accidents rarely aligned so perfectly with motive. That afternoon, she called upon the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a few rose cuttings. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Crawley, was delighted to see her and promptly offered tea, though conversation quickly turned to the murder, as it always did. The poor woman, Mrs. Crawley sighed. She looked dreadfully pale at service yesterday, and Dr. Reed sitting just behind her, looking equally wretched. I dare say grief brings people together in the strangest ways. Yes, said Miss Marple. Grief has a most singular talent for revealing the truth about one's attachments. She asked a few seemingly idle questions. When had Mrs. Harcourt last visited the church office? Had she requested any special masses? Had she been seen with Dr. Reed before the tragedy? The answers came readily. The widow had indeed called at the vicarage 2 days before the dinner, leaving an envelope for the parish fund, and the doctor had accompanied her, though he claimed it was mere coincidence. Miss Marple thanked her hostess and took her leave, her mind already busy weaving these new threads into her tapestry of deduction. The following day brought a turn in the case. A telegram arrived from London. Mr. Denham had been found dead in his rooms, an apparent suicide. A note lay beside him, written in his own hand. Forgive me, I cannot endure what is coming. The news struck St. Mildred's like thunder. To the villagers the matter seemed settled. They saw in Denham's death the final act of guilt. But Miss Marple's expression when told was one of sorrow rather than satisfaction. No, Inspector, she said quietly when Craden brought the news to her cottage. This is too neat, too soon. Guilt seldom resolves itself so obligingly. I fear we are being shown a conclusion meant to satisfy, not to enlighten. That evening, as the wind rattled the panes, Miss Marple took out her old notebook and began to list what she knew. Each name, each action, each motive. Beneath Dr. Reed's, she wrote a single question mark. Beneath Mrs. Harcourt's, too. The pattern that emerged was delicate but discernible. Denham's debts cleared, Reed's reputation preserved, the widow free and wealthy. Yet something still jarred. The timing of the poison, the certainty that Mr. Harcourt alone would drink from that decanter first. For all its apparent randomness, it required foreknowledge and planning, and only someone within the household, someone who had observed their habits intimately, could possess such knowledge. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Elmwood Manor. The house felt emptier than before. Even the air seemed reluctant to linger. She requested a word with Alice, the young maid who had wept in her garden days earlier. The girl was nervous, glancing constantly toward the door. "It wasn't me, miss," she whispered. "I told the inspector. I only did as cook said. I set the table, nothing more." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I believe you, my dear. But tell me, on the day of the dinner, did anyone enter the dining room before the guests arrived?" Alice frowned, thinking. "Only the doctor, miss. He came to see if Mr. Harcourt needed a tonic. Said he'd wait in the hall till they were ready. But I saw him go in, just for a minute." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That's very helpful, Alice, and you did right to tell the truth." That evening she sent another note to Inspector Craden, short and decisive. "Please arrange to meet Dr. Reed at Elmwood Manor tomorrow evening. I think the matter will bear a little illumination." When the appointed hour came, the manor stood bathed in lamplight once more. Mrs. Harcourt, pale and trembling, had been persuaded to attend at the inspector's request. Dr. Reed arrived soon after, his face drawn, his composure brittle. Miss Marple greeted them with the same gentle courtesy she might have shown at any tea-party. "I'm so grateful you could all come," she said, settling herself by the hearth. "I thought it best we speak plainly. We have all been misled, myself included, by appearances. The truth, as it so often does, lies in the smallest detail." Her eyes rested on the doctor, whose hands clenched tightly behind his back. When Mr. Harcourt died, there was a moment, just before the glass fell, when Mrs. Harcourt reached for his hand. Not in horror, but in hesitation. She was uncertain whether he would drink, you see, because she knew he should not have. Mrs. Harcourt gasped, rising from her chair. But Miss Marple's calm voice continued. "You didn't kill your husband, my dear. You only knew what was meant to happen. The poison was placed in the decanter earlier that morning by someone who believed you would share the glass. But your nerves betrayed you, and you refused it. The plan went awry." Her gaze turned to Dr. Reed. "You had both motive and opportunity, Doctor. The fingerprints upon the stopper, your visit to the dining room, your secret correspondence. You meant to spare her disgrace, perhaps even win her gratitude. But murder, once begun, never obeys its maker." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Dr. Reed's shoulders sagged, and his voice, when it came, was barely audible. "He was going to ruin her," he said hoarsely. "That letter, he found out about our meetings. He was going to expose her, destroy everything. I thought, if he were gone—" Miss Marple's expression was gentle, almost sorrowful. "You thought love could excuse the act, but love, my dear doctor, never thrives upon death." Outside, the church bell struck 9, solemn and steady, as Inspector Craden led the trembling man away. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple looked toward the darkened window, her reflection faint against the glass. The village would stir again with talk, of course. It always did. But beneath it all would linger the faint chill of knowledge. That evil, in St. Mildred's, had worn once more the face of gentility, and that only a quiet old lady with knitting needles had truly seen it coming. The dawn following Dr. Reed's confession rose bleak and colourless, its chill seeming to seep into every cobblestone of St. Mildred's. Word of the arrest spread faster than the frost melted, whispered from the post office to the bakery, and finally carried, with great solemnity, to the tea-room where speculation bloomed once more like weeds in spring. To most, the matter was concluded. The doctor's guilt, confessed in Miss Marple's calm presence, seemed irrefutable. The story fit so perfectly that it required no further embroidery. Yet Miss Marple herself, though polite when congratulated for her cleverness, did not share their easy satisfaction. She had lived long enough to know that the neatest endings were often only the beginning of something still tangled beneath the surface. By mid-morning, Inspector Craden called upon her again. He looked older, as though the long nights of investigation had carved new lines upon his face. "It's over, I think," he said, accepting the tea she poured. "Reed's admitted to everything. Tampering with the bottle, dosing the decanter, even writing a false prescription to procure the digitalis. He claims he acted alone." Miss Marple stirred her own cup thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Harcourt? She's distraught, naturally. Says she knew nothing until that night. He told her after it was done, begged her to keep silent. I dare say she'll leave St. Mildred's soon. People are already whispering." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes were distant. "It does seem to tie up neatly, doesn't it? Too neatly, perhaps." Craden gave a weary smile. "You're not content even now. The man confessed, for heaven's sake." "Oh, confessions," she said softly. "They are strange things, Inspector. Some are born of guilt, some of pride, and some of despair. The trick lies in knowing which one you are hearing." He frowned. "You think Reed lied?" "I think," she said, "he told the truth as he believed it, or as someone wished him to believe it. There's a difference. Craden sighed and rose to leave, half amused, half exasperated. "Well, if you find another murderer hiding under the rose bushes, you'll let me know." When he was gone, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched. There was one image that would not leave her mind: the look on Mrs. Harcourt's face the moment Reed confessed. It had not been shock nor grief, but something subtler, quieter, relief. Relief that someone else had spoken the words she would never need to utter. That was the kind of relief one saw in women who had been saved from exposure, not those who had merely been freed from danger. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual path through the village, stopping at the churchyard under the pretext of tending the small memorial garden. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and cut flowers. She was kneeling by a bed of fading marigolds when Mrs. Crawley approached, bundled in her shawl. "Dreadful business," she murmured, leaning on the gate. "Still, it's a mercy it's done with. I always thought the doctor too good to be true. Those quiet ones usually are." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "And yet I think Dr. Reed was precisely as good as he seemed. Too good, perhaps, for what befell him. Perhaps for what befell him. Perhaps for what—" Mrs. Crawley tilted her head. "You don't mean—" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said quickly. "Only that kindness is so easily misused by cleverer minds." That evening, as dusk settled like smoke across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, rereading her notes. She kept them not as trophies, but as reminders, each case its own small study in the unchanging nature of human weakness. Yet as she scanned her list of names, Harcourt, Reed, Denham, she felt the faintest tremor of unease. Denham's death had been too convenient, too timely, Reed's confession too thorough, and Mrs. Harcourt, though freed from suspicion, remained in possession of everything her husband's death had afforded her: wealth, reputation, and the sympathy of all. At precisely 8:30, a soft knock sounded. When she opened the door, Mrs. Harcourt stood upon the step, wrapped in a dark cloak, her veil drawn low. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice strained. I couldn't remain in that house another moment. Everywhere I turn, I see him. I thought perhaps you might advise me." Miss Marple gestured her inside. "Of course, my dear. Sit by the fire. A little warmth does the nerves good." The widow obeyed, removing her gloves with trembling fingers. "It's all so terrible," she whispered. "To think Dr. Reed, dear kind man, could be driven to such madness. I can hardly bear it, indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "He was devoted to you, wasn't he?" Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flickered. I suppose he admired me, yes, but I never encouraged him." "You mustn't think, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "I think nothing at all save what people tell me, though of course one sometimes hears what is not said rather more clearly." The silence stretched. Then Mrs. Harcourt rose suddenly. "I should go. I've said too much." But Miss Marple's tone remained calm, even affectionate. "You've said just enough, I think. I should like to show you something before you leave." She crossed to the bureau and drew out a small envelope sealed with red wax. "Inspector Craden left this here by mistake after our last meeting. It's a copy of Dr. Reed's written confession. Would you care to see it?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes darted across the page as she read, and Miss Marple watched. Not the words, but the woman's face. When she reached the final line, her hand trembled slightly. "It's dreadful," she whispered. "He says he did it for me." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That line has puzzled me too. You see, my dear, guilt is a curious thing. It can be planted like a seed, watered by suggestion until it grows into full conviction. Dr. Reed believed you would be ruined if your husband read that letter, didn't he? He thought you feared exposure." Mrs. Harcourt's lips parted, but no sound came. "It was clever of you," Miss Marple continued, her voice as gentle as if discussing roses. "You told him only what you wished him to know, that your husband meant to destroy you, that the letter would reveal some terrible shame, and when he spoke of helping, you let him believe that the only way was through silence, eternal silence. He did your work for you, and when the truth began to surface, you let him confess, believing himself guilty. It saved you the trouble of another lie." Mrs. Harcourt sank into the chair, as though the strength had drained from her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He was going to leave me with nothing. He'd already arranged to change his will. Everything I built would have been lost. And Reed, he adored me. I only meant for him to frighten my husband, not to—" Her voice broke. "Intent," said Miss Marple softly, "is a fine thread to balance upon. It tends to fray when pulled." The room was silent save for the ticking of the clock. Finally, Mrs. Harcourt rose, her composure returning in a brittle mask. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, you're quite right. I rarely do. But I believe Inspector Craden will find it shortly. You see the copy of that letter you claimed to destroy? There was another in the solicitor's office. It arrived this morning. A curious coincidence, really. The settlement mentioned in it was not financial at all. It concerned your husband's arrangement to transfer certain shares into your name. He meant to secure you, not ruin you." Mrs. Harcourt swayed, clutching the back of the chair. "No, that can't be true." "I'm afraid it is," Miss Marple said kindly. "And now Dr. Reed lies in custody, believing he killed to protect you from shame that never existed. I think when faced with that, even the kindest man might find his conscience clearer, and his memory sharper. It will not be long before he recalls who first suggested the poison, who whispered that digitalis was difficult to trace." For a long moment, Mrs. Harcourt stood motionless. Then, with sudden composure, she drew her veil. "You've been very clever, Miss Marple, but cleverness can be dangerous." "Only when used without conscience," Miss Marple replied. "And I have found over many years that conscience always returns, rather like the post, whether one wishes it or not." The door closed softly behind her visitor. Miss Marple sat very still, the faint crackle of the fire the only sound in the little room. At last she rose, poured herself a fresh cup of tea, and glanced through the window toward Elmwood Manor, where the light in the upper room had gone out. The story, she knew, was not yet finished, but its end was inevitable. The truth, once stirred from its shallow grave, always found its way to daylight. And as the evening deepened and the clock chimed 9, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts calm once more. Human nature, she reflected, was much like a tangled skein of wool, knotted, flawed, and yet entirely predictable, once one had the patience to follow each thread to its source. The next day dawned cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the shutters and sent dry leaves scuttling along the lane. Miss Marple was awake before sunrise, the faint clinking of her teacup keeping time with the steady rhythm of thought behind her calm eyes. She had slept little, for though her conversation with Mrs. Harcourt the night before had confirmed her suspicions, the matter was not yet resolved. In Miss Marple's experience, truth was not content merely to be known. It demanded to be revealed, however unpleasant the consequences. And though she pitied the woman, she knew there was only one path that could bring this business to its rightful end. Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Craden arrived once again, his heavy tread muffled by the frost on the path. He looked harried, his hat askew, and his temper short. "It's a cursed thing, Miss Marple," he began without preamble. "Reed's taken ill. The prison doctor says it's exhaustion and shock, but he's raving now. Says there's something he must tell me. Something he's remembered. I'm off to see him presently." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I rather thought he might." Craden stopped in his pacing. "You knew he'd recant?" "I thought his conscience might," she said simply. "Dr. Reed is not a man built for deception, Inspector. He's been carrying another's sin, and the weight of it was bound to break him." He stared at her for a moment, then gave a dry laugh. "You're telling me Mrs. Harcourt's behind it after all. But without proof, the Crown won't touch her." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Then perhaps we must let her prove it herself. Pride and fear are wonderful motivators. Both make people careless, particularly when they believe themselves safe. Craden frowned. "And what would you have me do? Invite her to tea and wait for a confession?" "Something very like that," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Only perhaps not tea this time. A visit to the manor would serve better." That afternoon the inspector followed her advice. He called upon Mrs. Harcourt under the guise of concluding formalities. The widow received him in her drawing-room, dressed in sombre grey, her manner subdued but composed. Craden offered polite condolences before casually mentioning that Dr. Reed had recovered somewhat and was now quite talkative. The effect was immediate. Her gloved hands tightened around the arm of her chair, though she quickly masked it with a laugh that was a fraction too light. "Oh, I am relieved to hear it," she said. "He must be suffering terribly." "Yes," Craden agreed, watching her closely. "He's been most anxious to set things right. Says there are still some details we must look into. The letter, for instance. Odd thing, that letter. Seems there was another copy found. In London." Mrs. Harcourt froze. The faintest flicker of disbelief crossed her face before she recovered. "Surely not. My husband destroyed everything before the dinner." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, yes. So you told us. Only the copy we've got suggests otherwise. Seems Mr. Harcourt meant to make quite a generous provision for you. Perhaps he didn't tell you, eh?" The silence that followed stretched thin as glass. Then, with remarkable poise, Mrs. Harcourt smiled. "I see what you're suggesting, Inspector. But I had nothing to do with my husband's death. Dr. Reed's own words condemn him. Surely you can't take the ravings of a sick man seriously." Craden tipped his hat. "Of course not, madam. But if you recall anything else, anything at all, I'd be obliged." He left her standing by the fire, her face pale, her expression unreadable. From the gate he saw a curtain twitch in the upper window, and behind it the unmistakable outline of Miss Marple, standing very still. She had been waiting, watching, as though the entire village were a chessboard, and she merely awaited the next move. That move came sooner than expected. Just past dusk, when the first lights began to gleam in the cottages, a carriage drew up outside Miss Marple's home. Mrs. Harcourt stepped down, her cloak drawn tight, her eyes fever-bright. She did not wait to be invited in. "You've told him, haven't you?" she hissed. "You've filled his head with lies about me, about that letter." Miss Marple closed the door behind her quietly. "I told him only what the facts suggested, my dear. But truth has a way of speaking on its own." Mrs. Harcourt's composure cracked. "You don't understand. I loved my husband once, before everything changed. He humiliated me, treated me as a foolish ornament. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him see me again. It wasn't meant to end this way." Miss Marple's expression was kind, but her voice was firm. "And yet it did. You may have set the fire without meaning for it to burn the house, but you lit the match all the same." Tears welled in the widow's eyes, but they did not fall. "Reed will never betray me," she whispered. "He's too weak, too honest," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "He already has. He remembered your visit to his surgery that afternoon, when you asked whether digitalis could ever be mistaken for something harmless. He thought it idle curiosity, of course, but the memory has come back to him now. Mrs. Harcourt went very still, her face drained of colour. For a long moment she seemed to weigh her options, the instinct to flee warring with the futility of doing so. When she spoke again, her tone was quieter, almost resigned. "You think you've won, don't you? That by unravelling me you've saved something. But you've never known what it is to live in fear of being discarded, of fading into nothing." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "My dear, most women have known it. Some endure it with courage, others with cunning. But there is always a choice. You made yours the night you poured that wine." Mrs. Harcourt's mouth trembled. "Then it's finished." "Not quite," said Miss Marple. "You can still choose truth over deceit, even now. Tell Inspector Craden the whole of it. Spare the doctor one final injustice. He is not made to bear your sins." For a long moment neither spoke. Then, without a word, Mrs. Harcourt turned and left. The door closed softly behind her, and Miss Marple sat down, her hands folded over her knitting, her expression grave. The next morning, the village awoke to the sound of a carriage on the high street once more. It was taking Mrs. Harcourt to the county jail. She had confessed everything late the night before, how she had planted the idea in Dr. Reed's mind, how she had encouraged his desperate act with half-truths and tears, and how she had watched her husband drink, never intending for it to go so far. The newspapers would later call it a crime of tragic persuasion, and some would even pity her. But to Miss Marple it was simply another tale of vanity and fear, of the small cruelties that ripen into calamity when left untended. When Inspector Craden stopped by her cottage one final time, his manner was thoughtful. "You were right again," he said, setting down his hat. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised any more." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, but you should be, Inspector. Surprise keeps us humble, and humility keeps us observant," he chuckled. "You know, there's something about your village that attracts trouble. Murder in the most unlikely places." "Human nature, Inspector," she replied. "It follows us wherever we build our pretty cottages and tend our gardens. One need only look closely." When he left, she stood at the window watching the morning light filter through the lace curtains. The village was peaceful again. The gossip would fade, as it always did, replaced soon enough by new scandals of chickens or committee meetings. Yet beneath that placid surface lay all the restless undercurrents of jealousy, pride, and longing that had always existed. Miss Marple turned back to her knitting, the faintest smile touching her lips. She had learned long ago that the world, even in its smallest corners, was full of mysteries, some solved, some waiting, and though evil might disguise itself in civility and candlelight, it could never quite conceal itself from a mind that understood above all the curious and unchanging habits of the human heart. Autumn had almost surrendered to winter by the time peace returned to St. Mildred's. The trees stood bare now, their branches like black veins against the pale sky, and the days had shortened to thin, grey hours broken only by the sound of the church bell or the bark of a distant dog. To most villagers the matter of the Harcourts was closed, tidied away like a distasteful story best forgotten. Mrs. Harcourt's confession had satisfied the newspapers, and Dr. Reed's name, though cleared by law, carried a faint melancholy that sympathy could not erase. He had been released, pale and subdued, and soon left the village for London, leaving behind an empty surgery and a cluster of disappointed patients who had admired both his skill and his courtesy. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her routines with her usual quiet precision. She neither gloried in the outcome nor shrank from its shadow. To her, it was simply one more study in the endlessly varied patterns of human folly. Yet even she felt a lingering restlessness, as though a single thread in the tapestry still tugged loose. Some small part of her refused to believe that the matter had fully settled itself. It was not doubt of guilt. Mrs. Harcourt had spoken plainly enough. It was rather an instinct born of long experience that the motives surrounding the crime were not yet wholly illuminated. Truth, she had often said, rarely sat in one chair. It moved about the room and left impressions wherever it went. It was on a grey Thursday morning that her sense of unease found substance. A knock came at her door, and there on the step stood Alice, the young maid from Elmwood Manor, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't know where else to go, Miss Marple," she stammered. "They've turned me out. The house is to be sold, and no one'll give me a reference now that, after everything." Miss Marple ushered her in at once, setting her by the hearth with a cup of tea. "There now, my dear," she said kindly. "A warm fire has comforted more hearts than sermons. Tell me what troubles you besides the obvious." The girl sniffed, twisting her handkerchief. "It's just, there's something I can't stop thinking about. I know I ought to leave it alone, but it won't sit right in my head. The night Mr. Harcourt died, before we served dinner, I went to fetch candles from the pantry, and I saw Mrs. Harcourt in the library. She wasn't alone. There was a man with her." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "A man? Not the doctor, surely?" Alice shook her head. "No, miss. He was shorter, older, looked like one of them tradesmen from town. I only caught a glimpse when the door opened, but he was holding a case like a salesman might. They were arguing low, but I heard her say something about, 'You've had enough already. I won't pay another shilling.' When she saw me, she shut the door quick. Later, after the murder, I thought maybe he was the wine merchant delivering that bottle Mr. Denham sent. But the timing's wrong. He left before supper, and there wasn't no cart outside." Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting motionless in her lap. "And you've told no one?" The girl shook her head miserably. "Who'd believe me? The inspector's done with it, and they'd only say I'm trying to stir trouble." "You did quite right to tell me," Miss Marple said gently. "Truth, like yeast, must be allowed to rise." When Alice had gone, Miss Marple remained thoughtful for a long while. An unknown visitor before dinner, a tradesman perhaps, or someone using that guise, was no trivial detail. It opened a window onto motives deeper than jealousy or desperation. She recalled the burned scrap of the letter found in the Harcourt's fireplace, the one bearing the London bank address. Settlement complete. Could there have been another party involved in that business? Someone with reason to silence Mr. Harcourt beyond the domestic quarrel that had already consumed the household? That afternoon she sent a discreet note to Inspector Craden requesting a call. When he arrived, she wasted no time. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone inquired after Mrs. Harcourt's estate since her arrest? Any claims, debts, or correspondence?" He rubbed his chin. "Only a few letters from solicitors handling the sale of the manor. And one peculiar inquiry from a Mr. Blake, a London broker, asking after certain documents Mr. Harcourt was meant to deliver before his death. We thought it irrelevant." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "Blake, you say? Might you describe him?" Craden looked puzzled. "I couldn't, but I can show you his letter." He produced a folded sheet from his pocketbook. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind of script produced by clerks who dealt daily in ledgers and contracts. As Miss Marple read, her brow furrowed. The letter referred obliquely to a private arrangement between Mr. Harcourt and an unnamed associate, an arrangement apparently unsettled at the time of his death. "This explains more than you might think," she said quietly. "Mr. Harcourt's finances were not merely comfortable, they were entangled. I dare say the good Mrs. Harcourt's anxieties were not unfounded, though her understanding of them was woefully incomplete." Craden frowned. "You're saying someone else had reason to see him gone?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, "that motives tend to overlap like ripples in a pond. One never knows which wave will reach the shore first." The following morning she took the early train to London, an expedition she undertook rarely, but with determined efficiency. At the brokerage address mentioned in the letter, she found a tidy office lined with ledgers and smelling faintly of ink. Mr. Blake, a thin man with anxious eyes, received her politely when she introduced herself as a friend of the late Mr. Harcourt. "I merely wished," she said in her most benign tone, "to understand what business might have weighed upon his mind in those final days. I gather he had some unfinished matter with your firm?" Blake hesitated, glancing toward the door. "Strictly confidential, madam, but since the client is deceased, it concerned an investment syndicate. Mr. Harcourt and a partner, one Charles Denham, were engaged in a transaction involving certain artworks, imported under questionable licenses. There were large sums at stake, and considerable risk. Mr. Harcourt grew uneasy, and withdrew, intending to expose Denham's irregularities. The letter you mention was likely a formal termination of their dealings." Miss Marple listened without interruption, though inwardly her mind was racing. "And did Mr. Denham know of this?" "Almost certainly," Blake admitted. "He came here the very morning after Mr. Harcourt's death, demanding access to the accounts. When I refused, he stormed out. I've heard nothing since." She thanked him warmly and took her leave, her suspicions now sharpened to a fine point. Denham's supposed suicide had always troubled her. The timing, the convenience, the absence of any witness. It was all too smooth, too symmetrical, as if arranged by someone well versed in the art of closure. Upon her return to St. Mildred's, she found Inspector Craden waiting. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he said with a half-smile. "And so have I. We've checked Denham's London lodgings. The coroner's verdict stands. But there's an odd thing. No trace of the poison he supposedly took, and the handwriting in his note doesn't match his earlier letters." Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "Then it appears our story has yet another chapter. I fear the hand that guided Dr. Reed's tragedy guided this one as well." "You mean Mrs. Harcourt?" She shook her head. "No. The same cleverness, the same instinct for disguise, but not the same temperament. Mrs. Harcourt's deceit was born of panic. This other mind works from calculation. Someone ensured silence on every front." Craden leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple's answer came softly. "The man Alice saw in the library. I believe he was no tradesman, but Denham's agent, or perhaps Denham himself, returning under another name to reclaim what he feared Mr. Harcourt would expose. When Mrs. Harcourt refused him money, he acted otherwise, and when the scandal broke, he erased himself with a counterfeit death. There is method in such vanishing acts." Craden's brow furrowed. "You think Denham's alive?" "I think," she said, "that St. Mildred's may not have seen the last of him." Outside dusk had fallen, and the first snow of the season drifted down in slow, whispering flakes. Through the half-frozen glass, Miss Marple watched the lights of the village flicker to life, one by one. The case, it seemed, was not finished after all. The shadow that had fallen over Elmwood Manor still stretched further than anyone had guessed, and somewhere, perhaps in London, perhaps nearer, a man who had profited from deceit once before was planning his next move, confident that the village had already forgotten him. But Miss Marple never forgot. She sat quietly by the fire, her eyes reflecting the flame's small glow, and thought of the many faces evil wore, love, fear, greed, survival, and of how inevitably Beneath each mask, the same familiar pattern would emerge. The human heart, she reflected, could never conceal its true design for long, not from one who had spent a lifetime studying its stitches. And so she waited, patient and unhurried, for the next thread to appear. Thread to appear. Thread. Snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing St. Mildred's in a quiet so deep it felt almost sacred. By morning the rooftops and hedges wore a fragile white mantle, and the whole village seemed paused, holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, and moved about her little cottage with the same calm efficiency that had carried her through storms far worse than snow. But her thoughts were not on the weather. They were fixed upon the strange, unfinished story that still lingered like smoke over Elmwood Manor. The day before, Inspector Craden had left her with more questions than comfort. Denham's supposed suicide now appeared a fabrication, and the mysterious visitor seen by Alice had become the missing piece that refused to fit neatly into any frame. Miss Marple had spent the night thinking. Quiet, methodical thinking, the sort that knits stray threads into pattern. By breakfast she had arrived at one clear conviction. The man the maid had seen had not been Denham himself, but someone acting for him, perhaps even posing as a messenger or broker to reclaim certain incriminating documents. That someone, she felt certain, had not vanished at all. At 10:30, as she was polishing her teacup with a linen cloth, a shadow darkened the frosted glass of her window. There came a hesitant knock, followed by a voice she recognized at once, measured, urbane, and distinctly out of place among the village accents. "Miss Marple! Forgive me for calling unannounced." She opened the door. There stood Mr. Blake, the London broker she had visited days earlier. His overcoat was dusted with snow, and his thin face bore an expression of uneasy civility. "My dear Mr. Blake," she said pleasantly, stepping aside, "you must come in at once. The trains are dreadful in this weather, I'm sure." He gave a polite bow and entered, glancing about as though fearing witnesses, even within the neat little parlour. "I shouldn't impose," he murmured, "but I've had rather troubling news. I felt it my duty to inform you, since you've taken such an interest in Mr. Harcourt's affairs." Miss Marple motioned him to a chair and poured the tea. "Then you were quite right to come. Sugar, I think?" He nodded absently. "It's about Mr. Denham, or the man we believe to be him. Scotland Yard contacted our office this morning. They've been tracing certain bank withdrawals made after the supposed date of his death. Substantial amounts, all drawn under an alias, one Charles Dent." Miss Marple's blue eyes glimmered faintly over her teacup. "Dent," she repeated softly. "A modest alteration of Denham, don't you think? He never was an imaginative man." Blake leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You suspected this, didn't you? You hinted as much when we spoke. I thought it impossible, until now." "Oh, nothing is impossible where self-interest is concerned," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It's merely a question of how far a man will go to protect it." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "The withdrawals correspond to shipments. Artworks, I believe. Items that had been seized pending investigation into their authenticity. Someone's reclaiming them, Miss Marple. Quietly, but systematically. I thought you should know." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Yes, that would be very much in character. You see, Mr. Denham, or Mr. Dent as he now prefers, has never understood that the cleverest crimes are rarely the safest. They rely too heavily on other people's silence." At that moment, a knock sounded again. This one brisk, official. Inspector Craden stepped in, brushing the snow from his coat. His eyebrows lifted slightly when he saw Blake. "Well, this is a convenient gathering," he said, "and I was just coming to tell you both that the Yard's confirmed our suspicions. The body found in Denham's lodgings wasn't him at all. Poor devil was a clerk from his old firm. Died of the same poison, but days earlier. Seems our friend borrowed the corpse to stage his exit. Blake made a strangled sound. Miss Marple merely sighed. Such efficiency, she said quietly. It's almost admirable in a deplorable way. Craden took the chair opposite her. We've circulated his likeness, but if he's using an alias, he may already have slipped abroad. Still, something tells me he's not far. He's got business unfinished here. Money uncollected, perhaps, or a grudge. Miss Marple set down her teacup. No, Inspector. He'll come back for something far simpler. Reassurance. Men like Mr. Denham live on the confidence that they are cleverer than everyone else. When that illusion wavers, they must restore it, often by returning to the scene of their success. Craden gave a short laugh. You mean he'll walk right back into the village? Not walk, she said gently, but he will find a way to stand here again, to see for himself whether the world still sleeps. Vanity, you see, is the final tether of the criminal mind. That evening, as the snow deepened, the three of them dined simply at Miss Marple's cottage, poring over letters and records by the firelight. Craden, though sceptical, could not help admiring the old lady's composure. Blake, on the other hand, grew increasingly uneasy. If he returns, he murmured, what will he do? Surely he knows discovery means prison. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Oh, he knows. But discovery to a man like that is only another puzzle to outwit. If he believes he can charm or deceive his way through one more dinner, one more conversation, he will risk it. I expect, in fact, that he already has. The inspector frowned. Meaning what? She rose and crossed to her writing desk, drawing out an envelope. This arrived this afternoon before either of you came. No return address, but the hand is familiar. She passed it to him. Inside lay a short note written in a slanted, confident script. My dear Miss Marple, you are, I think, a connoisseur of human nature, and as such you will appreciate that even the most wayward souls crave understanding. I shall be in your charming village tomorrow evening to settle a final matter regarding the late Mr. Harcourt's estate. I trust you will not inform the authorities until we've spoken. One must allow a gentleman his explanations after all. C.D. Craden cursed softly under his breath. Blake went white. Miss Marple, however, smiled, a small, almost weary smile. He always did have a flair for drama, she said. Very well, then. We shall let him have his performance. But this time, Inspector, we will write the ending. By the next evening, St. Mildred's was still and silent beneath a sheet of ice. The village inn, where travellers occasionally paused between trains, was nearly empty save for a single corner table laid for two. Miss Marple sat there, her shawl drawn tight, her knitting bag beside her chair. Craden and two constables waited discreetly in the adjoining room. At 7:30, the door opened and a man entered. His overcoat fine, his gait confident, his smile easy. Only the eyes betrayed him, sharp, watchful, the eyes of a man who measured every glance for advantage. Miss Marple, he said smoothly, removing his gloves. What a pleasure after so much unpleasantness. She inclined her head. Indeed, Mr. Denham, or is it Dent now? You've gone to remarkable trouble for a man who could have started fresh anywhere. He laughed softly. Fresh starts are for the poor, Miss Marple. I prefer continuations. There are still assets here, still debts to settle. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You see, I never intended anyone to die. Harcourt was a fool, his wife a hysteric. I meant only to retrieve what was mine. And when things went wrong? She asked gently. Adaptation, he said simply. One must survive, even if that means using corpses as props. He smiled faintly, but the edge of control flickered. You know, Miss Marple, you'd have made an excellent accomplice if your moral compass weren't so inflexible." She looked at him with something like pity. "And you would have made a decent man, Mr. Denham, if your vanity weren't so large. You see, it always betrays you." Before he could respond, the door to the next room opened. Craden stepped forward, calm and steady, his men at his back. For a heartbeat, Denham's expression hardened. But then he laughed again, softly, almost admiringly. "Touché, madame. It seems the curtain has fallen after all. Fallen after all." For as the inspector led him away, Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded on the table. Outside, the snow had begun again, whispering against the windows. She felt no triumph, only a deep, familiar melancholy, the kind that followed every revelation, no matter how just. Evil, she reflected, was rarely spectacular. It crept in like frost, slow, silent, inevitable. And yet, even frost melted under the steady warmth of light. She gathered her knitting, rose, and stepped out into the night, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet, knowing that once again the quiet balance of St. Mildred's had been restored, at least for a little while. The morning after Mr. Denham's arrest arrived sharp and brittle, sunlight glancing off the frozen hedgerows like shards of glass. St. Mildred's, though outwardly calm, thrummed beneath the surface with a nervous excitement. In the bakery, the post office, and the tea-room, everyone seemed to speak in hushed tones, leaning closer to whisper the latest detail. "He came back to face Miss Marple herself," said Mrs. Fenton with relish, walked straight into the trap, as bold as brass. Others spoke with disbelief that such a man had hidden among them for so long, dining at their tables and smiling so easily. Yet behind all the gossip lay an unspoken question. Why had he come back at all? What unfinished thread had drawn him once more into the snare of his own making? Miss Marple, meanwhile, had no appetite for gossip. She spent that morning quietly tending her garden, the crisp air turning her breath to mist. She trimmed the frost-bitten roses with delicate precision, her thoughts as methodical as her hands. She had watched Denham's capture without elation. There was something too polished about his surrender, too poised. He had come to her not as a man cornered, but as one performing a final act of his choosing. And while he now sat behind iron bars, awaiting formal charges, she suspected that his scheme, like a shadow, stretched further than anyone yet realized. Inspector Craden arrived at midday, stamping the snow from his boots, his cheeks red from the cold. "We've got him well and proper this time," he declared, lowering himself into her armchair. "He's confessed enough to satisfy the Crown. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy to murder. Said the poisoning was all part of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Claims he never meant to kill Harcourt, only frighten him into silence." Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her eyes serene but questioning. "And you believe him?" Craden sighed. "No, but it doesn't matter what I believe, not entirely. The evidence will stand. We've traced the false accounts, the artwork, even the papers he took from Elmwood Manor. He's finished, Miss Marple. The court will see to that." "Yes," she said softly. "But finished men do not usually smile as he did when they are taken away." The inspector frowned. "He's an actor, that one. Always was. The sort who'd charm the gallows if given 5 minutes alone with the hangman." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Actors crave audiences, Inspector, and when denied one, they sometimes create their own stage." Craden leaned forward. "You think he's hiding something else?" "I think he has one more performance left in him," she said quietly, "and I should very much like to see it before the curtain falls." That afternoon she paid a visit to the jail. The constable on duty, accustomed to her gentle persistence, made no objection. Denham was in the visitors' room, seated at the narrow table. his hands folded neatly, as if awaiting a luncheon companion rather than a detective. He looked remarkably composed, his hair perfectly arranged, his expression courteous. "My dear Miss Marple," he said with that familiar, smooth smile, "I wondered how long it would take before you came to gloat." "I never gloat," she replied mildly. "I came to understand." "Understand?" He tilted his head. "Surely you've understood everything already. I was careless, overconfident. You, on the other hand, have the virtues of patience and morality. You've won. That's the whole story." "Stories rarely end so simply," she said. "There's always a coda, a final note to balance the melody. You returned to St. Mildred's not merely for pride. You came to settle something, or someone." His smile faltered, the first crack in the mask. "You flatter me with such intrigue." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Flattery is wasted on a man who already admires himself so thoroughly. "Tell me, Mr. Denham, what business could be worth risking capture? Not money, you have that tucked away. Not reputation, that was long forfeited. What remained?" For the first time he looked away. His fingers tapped lightly on the table. "There are things," he said slowly, "that cannot be left unresolved. Promises, debts, memories. Revenge, perhaps." He looked up sharply. "Revenge? On whom?" "Mrs. Harcourt is imprisoned, her husband dead, Dr. Reed disgraced, my business partner exposed. Tell me, Miss Marple, who's left to punish?" Her gaze did not waver. "You're clever enough to destroy others without reason, but not clever enough to forget those who aided you. There was someone else, wasn't there? A partner who didn't vanish so easily." His expression flickered. Anger, surprise, admiration, all at once. "You really are extraordinary," he murmured. "Yes, there was another. A silent investor, you might say. Someone who believed in my ventures. He took the lion's share of the profit when I disappeared, left me to clean up the consequences." "And you came back to retrieve what he owed you," Miss Marple finished softly. Denham's smile returned, smaller, more dangerous. "I came back to watch him squirm, but it seems you've interrupted the finale." "I wonder," she said, "because I rather think your finale has yet to begin." The guard announced the end of visiting hours, and she rose to leave. "Good day, Mr. Denham," she said gently. "I'll see you again soon." He inclined his head, amused. "You always do, Miss Marple. You always do." As she stepped out into the cold evening, she felt the stirrings of unease deepen. If Denham had returned not for pride, but for unfinished business, then someone else, someone still in the village, was part of his design. She thought again of the night he was caught, of the letter that had lured him back. He had written that letter, certainly, but perhaps not alone. There had been precision in its phrasing, a tone of mutual understanding. Denham had always preferred to work through accomplices. He seldom dirtied his own hands when others could be persuaded to do so. The next day brought fresh confirmation. Inspector Craden arrived, his expression troubled. "You were right again, I'm afraid. Denham's escaped." Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "Escaped?" "During transfer to London. The van was ambushed on the road near Reading. 2 guards knocked unconscious. No sign of Denham since. Whoever helped him knew the route and timing perfectly." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Which means they had information only the police could have, or someone with access to the schedule." Craden swore under his breath. "There's more. One of the clerks at headquarters, young fellow named Partridge, disappeared the same morning. Left his post, no trace since." "Partridge," she repeated softly. "Was he involved with the case?" "Minor duties. Filed reports, handled correspondence." "Correspondence," Miss Marple murmured. "That's always where mischief hides." She stood, her mind already moving. "Inspector, there's a pattern here, and it isn't finished. Denham didn't vanish into thin air. He's too theatrical for that. He'll make his reappearance soon, somewhere that matters to him. Elmwood Manor, Craden said grimly. It's being sold next week. He'd want to see it one last time. Precisely, said Miss Marple, and I think we must be there to greet him. 3 nights later, under a low, heavy moon, the two of them stood outside the shuttered house. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from distant chimneys. The manor loomed against the sky, its windows dark, except for one faint glow in the upper corridor. "He's here," Craden whispered. Miss Marple nodded. Men like him always returned to their stage. They moved quietly through the front hall, the boards creaking underfoot. Somewhere above, a door closed softly. Craden drew his pistol. Miss Marple lifted her lamp. The faint light revealed dust, abandoned furniture, the remnants of what had once been luxury. In the study they found the fire newly kindled and a half-empty glass of brandy on the mantel. Beside it lay a folded document, the deed of sale for Elmwood Manor. And there, in neat handwriting, a single signature, Charles Dent. Craden swore under his breath. "He's mocking us!" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He's ending the scene. He's passed on the house. To whom, I wonder?" Before she could finish, a shadow moved in the doorway. Denham stood there, immaculate as ever, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a faint bow. "You do have a talent for finales." But she noticed something then, the faint tremor in his hand, the sheen of sweat on his brow. Not triumph, she realized, but fear. "Who are you afraid of, Mr. Denham?" she asked quietly. "Not us." He hesitated, then gave a small, mirthless laugh. "Afraid, perhaps. The truth is, Miss Marple, I never escaped at all. Someone arranged it, for a price. I was supposed to deliver something tonight, something that belonged to Harcourt, but I think my partner would rather collect it without me." Even as he spoke, a faint creak came from behind them. A window opening, the whisper of snow dislodged from the sill. Craden turned sharply, but Miss Marple did not move. She only said very softly, "Yes, the final act has arrived," and as the lamplight flickered, a figure stepped into the room, one they both recognized at once. The true architect of the entire affair had returned, cloaked in the calm assurance of one who believed themselves beyond suspicion. It was Dr. Lionel Reed who stepped into the room. The lamplight caught the pallor of his face, the sheen of melted snow on his coat, and the gloved hands that clutched a small leather case against his chest. His eyes, normally mild and hesitant, were sharp now, cold with purpose. For a moment no one spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, pressing itself against the shutters to listen. Denham was the first to move. He gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Of course," he said hoarsely. "I should have known. The good doctor, our ever-dutiful accomplice. I wondered when you'd show your hand." Reed's voice was quiet, but it carried the brittle edge of restraint, long worn thin. "You've said enough, Denham. It's over," Miss Marple, who had neither flinched nor turned her gaze away, said in that soft, deceptively gentle tone that could slice through deceit like a blade. "I believe it is only over for those who are willing to tell the truth." "Doctor!" Reed's expression did not change, but his hand tightened around the case. Craden beside her had raised his revolver slightly. Though Miss Marple's faint touch upon his sleeve held him still, she could see the tremor in the doctor's jaw, the tension of a man standing at the edge of an abyss he had dug with his own careful hands. "You knew he would return," she said, her voice quiet, almost sorrowful. "You arranged it. You ensured his escape because you needed what he carried, the Harcourt papers." You've been looking for them since the beginning, haven't you? Reed took a single step forward, his eyes darting briefly to Denham. You think you understand everything, Miss Marple, but you don't. I did what was necessary. He deceived everyone, used us all. I couldn't let him disappear with the evidence that would destroy me, and others far beyond this village. Others? Craden demanded. You're saying you weren't working alone? Reed gave a short, humourless laugh. No one ever works alone in matters like these, Inspector. But you wouldn't understand that. There are men in London who invested heavily in Denham's schemes. When Harcourt threatened exposure, they panicked. Denham promised to handle it quietly. He involved me, blackmailed me rather, after discovering certain financial irregularities in my accounts. I wasn't supposed to be part of any murder, but once Harcourt died, I had no choice but to keep silent. Miss Marple's tone remained calm, though her eyes were alert, and when Mrs. Harcourt confessed, you allowed her to bear the full blame. You let an innocent woman hang her head while you hid behind your pity. Innocent? Reed said sharply, his composure fraying. She was no innocent. She wanted him dead. She begged for a way out of her marriage. She played the grieving widow well enough until she realized I meant to expose the truth and save her from the noose. But by then she'd decided to protect herself by destroying me instead. I lost everything because of her and because of him. He gestured violently toward Denham. They all used me, every one of them. Denham's eyes gleamed with mocking amusement. My dear doctor, you've always been the easiest sort to use. You mistake conscience for courage. Quiet, Reed snapped, his voice cracking. The leather case shook in his hand. You think you've won, but this... He held it up slightly. This will finish what you started. Documents, ledgers, correspondence, names of every man who profited from your little empire. You'll burn for it. And you with me, Denham murmured. Reed's jaw clenched. For a long moment, the two men stared at one another, the fire crackling softly between them, the air thick with hatred and regret. Then Miss Marple spoke, so softly that even Craden turned to listen. Doctor, you've told yourself this is justice, but it isn't. It's revenge, and revenge, once begun, consumes the mind entirely. You've been driven by fear, not by righteousness. Reed's breath came quick and shallow. You think I don't know what fear is, Miss Marple? Every day since that dinner, I've lived with the sound of a man's glass shattering in my ears. His face, his eyes, they never leave me. I tried to atone, to convince myself I was different. But you can't wash away guilt when every other hand that touched it remains clean. Someone has to answer, perhaps, she said gently. But you cannot play executioner simply because you are haunted. For a heartbeat he faltered, as if her words had cut through the storm within him. Then Denham spoke again, smooth and deliberate, each syllable laced with poison. She's right, Lionel. You've never had the courage to finish anything. You hide behind women and old ladies and your own trembling conscience. You can't even decide which side you're on. Reed's eyes blazed. You made me this way, he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty hall. You ruined everything you touched, you. Miss Marple moved then, swift and sure despite her age. She stepped between them, her hand raised like a schoolmistress, calming two quarrelling boys. Enough, she said firmly. You, Mr. Denham, have no authority to accuse anyone of ruin. You've made a career of it. And you, Dr. Reed, must stop believing you can undo wickedness by committing more of it. For a long, trembling moment, no one moved. Then Craden stepped forward, his revolver steady. Dr. Reed, he said quietly, put the case down. Reed hesitated, his eyes darting between them. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry years of exhaustion, he placed the leather case gently on the desk. You'll find everything you need there, he murmured. Every lie, every crime, every betrayal. Craden retrieved it carefully, signalling one of his men, who had appeared silently in the doorway, to take Reed into custody. As the constable led him away, Reed paused and turned back to Miss Marple. "You were right," he said softly. "It was never about justice, only guilt, and guilt has no end." When he was gone, Denham exhaled a long, slow breath. "Well," he said, almost cheerfully, "that was a relief. I feared he'd do something dramatic." Miss Marple looked at him gravely. "You should not mock tragedy, Mr. Denham. It tends to linger where it is least welcome." Craden snapped the cuffs onto Denham's wrists. "I've had enough of your performances. You'll get your stage soon enough, in court." Denham only smiled. "Perhaps. But courts are dull, Inspector. No imagination. They took him away, his laughter echoing faintly through the empty corridors. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the air was so still it seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple remained by the fire, staring at the dying embers. Craden returned after some time, the case in his hand, his face lined with fatigue. "It's all here," he said quietly. "Everything they did, every name, every transaction. This will bring down more than one respectable gentleman in London, I imagine." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Wickedness wears many fine coats, Inspector. It often takes the plainest people to strip them away." He gave a small smile. "Meaning you, I suppose? Meaning truth," she said simply. "It comes in time, even to those who least wish to see it." They left Elmwood Manor together, their footprints marking the snow. Behind them, the old house loomed silent, its windows dark once more. Within its walls, the ghosts of that ill-fated dinner still lingered. The clink of a glass, the murmur of polite laughter, the sudden silence that had begun it all. In the days that followed, St. Mildred's slowly returned to its gentle rhythm. Mrs. Price gossiped about the case for a week, and then turned her attentions to the vicar's new sermon. The postmistress claimed to have known from the very start that Denham was no true gentleman, and Miss Marple, seated once more in her sunny sitting-room, resumed her knitting, her blue eyes distant but calm. When Inspector Craden came to say his farewell before returning to London, he found her thus, peaceful, composed, a soft smile touching her lips. "I sometimes wonder," he said as he took her hand, "whether you see these things before they even begin." She looked up at him thoughtfully. "No, Inspector, I merely listen. People always tell you what they intend, if you're quiet long enough. The trick is to know which words are the truth, and which are only the lies they tell themselves." As he left, the clock struck noon, and Miss Marple rose to draw back the curtain. Outside the snow had melted, revealing the familiar cobblestone street and the first faint buds of winter roses pushing through the frost. Life, she thought, always found a way to return, no matter how dark the season. And yet, as she turned back to her chair, she glanced once toward the empty road beyond the hedgerows, and wondered, not with fear, but with quiet inevitability, what new story might one day find its way to her door. For in St. Mildred's, as everywhere, human nature never slept for long. 2 weeks had passed since the arrests, and the village of St. Mildred's had begun, in its quiet English way, to forget. The newspapers had printed their sensational headlines, "The Elmwood Conspiracy Exposed," and promptly moved on to fresher scandals. The London police had taken the prisoners away. The manor had been sealed pending further investigation, and the villagers, though they still spoke in low tones of murder and deceit, found comfort in the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. Yet Miss Marple, who had lived too long to mistake silence for peace, sensed a subtle disturbance lingering still, like the faint echo of a storm, long after the clouds had cleared. On the surface, all appeared settled. Dr. Reed remained in custody, awaiting trial, and Denham, his arrogance undiminished, had been transferred to London to face charges of fraud and conspiracy. The Harcourt estate, so long a symbol of pride and envy, stood empty under the winter sky, its shutters drawn tight. But Miss Marple's instincts, sharpened over years of quiet observation, told her that something about the affair remained unfinished. Crimes, she often reflected, were like weeds. One might cut them down, but unless the roots were found, they always returned in unexpected places. It was on a Sunday morning, crisp and cold, that the first hint of unease returned. Miss Marple had just come from the early service, and was crossing the churchyard when she saw a familiar figure waiting by the gate. Inspector Craden, looking unusually grave for a man who prided himself on being unflappable. "Miss Marple," he said by way of greeting, "I wish I were here with good news, but it seems our case has taken yet another turn." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Not an escape, I hope?" He shook his head. "No, not this time. Dr. Reed is dead." She paused, her gloved hands tightening around her prayer book. "Dead? How?" "Poison," Craden said grimly. "He collapsed in his cell last night. Same symptoms as Harcourt, the same slow paralysis. The prison doctor swears no one could have reached him, but someone did. A letter was found among his things. A letter from Denham." Miss Marple stood very still, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Denham," she repeated quietly. "Still playing his games," Craden nodded. "The letter's clever, apologetic in tone, all about forgiveness and redemption, but with one curious line near the end. He wrote, 'When the truth is shared between two men, only one can live to tell it.' You see what that implies?" "Yes," she said softly. "It implies that Denham has no intention of sharing anything at all." By afternoon, she had agreed to accompany the inspector to London. The train journey was slow, the landscape a blur of snow-covered fields and grey sky. Craden, opposite her, went over his notes again and again, muttering about logistics and locked cells. Miss Marple, meanwhile, watched the countryside roll past with quiet thoughtfulness. She did not speak until they were nearly at Paddington. "You say the poison was the same," she said finally. "Digitalis again. That's what the prison doctor believes. Reed must have ingested it somehow. Perhaps hidden in a piece of bread or in the ink of the letter itself. But how Denham could have managed that, confined as he is, I can't imagine." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. "Oh, I can. Mr. Denham has always found ways to act through others. He was, if you recall, quite fond of intermediaries." At the prison, they were received by the warden, a heavy-set man with a nervous manner. He led them to the small, bare cell where Reed had spent his final hours. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, like rust. On the narrow cot lay a folded blanket, neatly arranged. On the floor beside it, a half-finished letter in the doctor's precise hand. Miss Marple bent over it, reading silently. The words were calm, almost detached. A man seeking to explain himself to no one in particular. But the final lines caught her attention. "Justice, I have learned, is rarely pure. Sometimes it merely changes hands. Tell Miss Marple that I did what I could to stop him, but he was always one step ahead. She straightened slowly. "So he knew," she murmured. "Even then," Craden looked over her shoulder. "He's admitting Denham killed Harcourt, then?" "More than that," she said quietly. "He's warning us that Denham's game isn't finished. It's being continued by someone else." That evening they visited Denham himself. The man was seated in the interrogation room, his cuffs neatly fastened, his expression one of amused indifference. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he greeted them pleasantly. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me. Craden wasted no time. Reed's dead, poisoned. You know anything about that? Denham's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Poisoned? How unfortunate. He was such a sensitive soul. Save your sympathy, Craden snapped. That letter you sent him, what was it? Denham smiled faintly. A farewell. We all need closure, Inspector. Even the condemned. Miss Marple watched him steadily. You had help, didn't you? Someone loyal. Someone still working for you. He met her gaze, his eyes glinting with admiration. Ah, Miss Marple, you do make everything sound so dramatic. Help, loyalty, conspiracy, it's all very operatic. But sometimes people act not out of loyalty, but out of fear. A single word can move mountains when whispered to the right ear. And what did you whisper? She asked. He leaned forward, his smile widening. That depends. How well do you know your own inspector here? Craden stiffened, colour rising in his face. You're trying to twist things again, Denham. It won't work. Twist? Denham's tone was mild. Oh, no. I merely remind you that corruption, like guilt, is rarely confined to one man. The world runs on favours, Miss Marple. Someone always opens the door. Before she could respond, the guard announced that the time was up. As they were leaving, Denham called after her. You see, Miss Marple, I've never been afraid of death. It's obscurity I despise. You'll remember me long after the rest of them have faded. Back at the station, Craden was silent. Only when they reached the carriage did he speak, his voice low and uneasy. He's bluffing, trying to rattle us. That's all. Miss Marple looked out at the passing lamps flickering through the fog. Perhaps. But bluffing requires an audience, Inspector. I think he was speaking to you more than to me. That night, she returned to her lodging unable to rest. She sat by the window, watching the city's restless lights shimmer through the mist. Something about Denham's composure unsettled her. It wasn't the confidence of a man resigned to punishment. It was the calm of someone who believed he still held the upper hand. She reviewed everything she knew. The poison, the letters, the escape, the deaths, and somewhere in that labyrinth of deceit, a single thread glimmered faintly. She rose, pulled her shawl tight, and went to her writing desk. From her bag she drew the half-burnt letter she had kept from Elmwood Manor, the one that had first mentioned the settlement complete. Holding it under the lamplight, she traced the faint watermark at the edge of the paper. It was identical to the stationery found in Reed's cell, not from Denham's possession at all, but from the Harcourt household, which meant the same source had provided both. The same careful hand had orchestrated every stage, from the dinner to the final deaths. She sat back slowly. Not Denham, she whispered to herself. He's clever, but he's a puppet too. There's someone else still moving the strings. The next morning she sought out Craden at his London office. Inspector, she said quietly, we've both been deceived. There's one name we've overlooked. He looked up, weary but curious. Who? The solicitor, she said. Mr. Alderton, the man handling the Harcourt estate. Every letter, every document, every transaction passed through his hands. He knew the will, the debts, even the terms of the settlement. He's the only one who profited from every side. Craden's eyes widened. Good Lord, you're right. He drafted the deed of sale too. Miss Marple nodded. And if I'm not mistaken, he also supplied the paper and ink Denham used for his letters. The same ink, perhaps, that carried poison. By noon, they had a warrant. Alderton was arrested at his chambers that afternoon, caught burning correspondence in the grate. When confronted, he said nothing, merely smiled the weary smile of a man who had gambled and lost. In his files were receipts linking him to Denham's fraudulent schemes, records of payments to Reed, and, most damning of all, an unsigned letter written in Mrs. Harcourt's hand. The original, not the copy she claimed to have destroyed. It was Alderton, not Denham, who had ensured its disappearance, turning every lie to his advantage. When Miss Marple left the station that evening, the winter sun was setting behind the rooftops, streaking the sky in pale gold. Craden walked beside her, shaking his head. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. She smiled faintly. "We all see things when they choose to be seen, Inspector. Truth hides in plain sight, waiting for patience rather than cleverness." He nodded, tipping his hat. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. God help the next man who tries to outwit you." She only laughed softly, her breath clouding in the frosty air. "Oh, I never outwit anyone, Inspector. I simply wait until they reveal themselves. They always do in the end." And as the train carried her back towards St. Mildred's, the lights of London fading behind her, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Evil had once again been unmasked, and the world, for now, seemed righted. Yet she knew, as she gazed out at the dark fields rushing past, that somewhere, in some quiet village or bustling city, human folly was already preparing its next performance. And when it did, she would be ready, with her knitting and her sharp, unassuming mind, to listen once more to the small, persistent voice of truth that never truly slept. The winter sun hung low over St. Mildred's, turning the snow-covered roofs to silver and the narrow lanes to ribbons of light. The affair of Elmwood Manor had at last drawn to its quiet close. The papers had printed their final editions, the trials concluded, and the names of those involved were already fading from conversation, though not, of course, from memory. In the post office, Mrs. Price now spoke more of the vicar's new sermon than of murder. At the tea-room, Mrs. Fenton had turned her gossip to recipes again. It was only Miss Marple who, in her little cottage at the edge of the village, continued to think of the matter in the way she thought of all tragedies, with calm reflection and the faint sadness that comes of understanding too well why people do what they do. She sat by the fire that afternoon, knitting needles moving gently, while the clock on the mantel ticked in its steady, unhurried rhythm. A knock sounded at her door, soft but distinct, and she knew before rising who it would be. Inspector Craden stood on the step, his hat in hand, looking more at ease than she had ever seen him. "You'll be glad to know," he began with a faint smile, "the last of it's done. Alderton confessed this morning. Claimed the poison for Reed's letter came from an old stock he kept for medical experiments. He's made a full statement. Turns out he'd been pulling the strings all along, using Denham and Reed like pieces on a board. Pieces on a board." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "I thought as much. A solicitor sees more secrets than a priest or a doctor, and with far less conscience about keeping them." Craden came inside, warming his hands near the fire. He admits to arranging Denham's escape too, paid a guard through intermediaries. Denham was to sign over the remaining funds, and then be silenced. But Reed's death forced his hand, and that was the end of the game. Justice, if one can call it that, has finally caught up. "Justice," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A curious word, isn't it? It so rarely brings comfort to those who ask for it." He studied her for a moment. "You're not satisfied?" "Oh, I'm content that the truth is known," she said, setting her knitting aside. "But satisfaction, no. These affairs are like broken china, Inspector. You may fit the pieces back together, but the cracks always show. Mr. Harcourt is still dead. Poor Reed lost himself long before his trial, and Mrs. Harcourt must live with what she became. Even Alderton, in his own cold way, will find the silence of a cell rather a hard audience for his cleverness. They all paid dearly for confusing ambition with need." Craden smiled faintly. "You put it better than any judge could." She returned his smile. "Oh, I never judge, Inspector. I only observe. Human nature explains itself, given patience." He stood preparing to leave. "If I might say so, Miss Marple, you've got the patience of a saint. I don't know how you do it, seeing through people as if they were glass, and yet never letting it sour you." "Perhaps," she said gently, "because I've learned that goodness hides as quietly as evil flaunts itself. The balance must be kept." When he had gone, the room fell still again, the faint crackle of the fire the only sound. Outside the snow was melting, small rivulets running down the lane toward the meadow. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and let her thoughts drift back to that first evening. The candlelight glinting on silver, the laughter, the sudden terrible silence when Mr. Harcourt's glass fell. How quickly civility had given way to chaos, and how, beneath every polite word, fear and greed had been waiting, patient as wolves. Yet even in that darkness there had been moments of pity. Reed's trembling remorse, Mrs. Harcourt's despair, the faint spark of shame in Denham's final glance. Evil was never pure, she thought. It was only ordinary weakness dressed in opportunity. Later, as dusk gathered and the church bell tolled 6, she walked out into her garden. The air smelled of thawing earth and chimney smoke, and somewhere in the hedgerow a blackbird sang, startlingly bright against the hush. She paused to listen. The melody rose and fell like a question, unanswered but peaceful. Life, relentless and ordinary, went on. The next morning brought a letter, posted from London and written in Inspector Craden's careful hand. It thanked her for her invaluable assistance, spoke of promotions and commendations, and ended with a single line that made her smile. "You were right. Truth comes in whispers, not shouts." She folded the paper neatly and tucked it into a drawer already full of such letters, tokens of other cases, other tragedies, each one a reminder of the quiet battles fought and won not by force, but by understanding. As the days lengthened into spring, St. Mildred's returned fully to its tranquil ways. The elm trees budded again, children played by the church wall, and the villagers resumed their endless, harmless gossip. Yet now and again, when a stranger passed through the village or a carriage stopped unexpectedly at the post office, people still spoke, half in jest, of that dreadful affair at Elmwood. And always, when the tale reached its end, someone would add with a knowing nod, "But of course, it was Miss Marple who saw it all before anyone else." She, hearing such talk from her window, would only shake her head and smile, for she knew that solving a murder was never a matter of cleverness alone. It was of listening, to words, to silences, to the small betrayals people made in their gestures and glances. It was of remembering that evil, though it wears many faces, always betrays itself by the same flaw, the belief that no one is watching. That evening, she sat once more by her fire, the day's post unopened beside her, and her knitting resting in her lap. The clock chimed softly, marking the end of another day, and she thought again of the curious constancy of life in her little village, the endless repetition of kindness and folly, of deceit and redemption. Outside, the first snowdrops had appeared beneath the hedges, brave white specks against the lingering frost. She leaned forward, smiling faintly at their fragile defiance. "Ah, well," she murmured as if to herself, "there will always be another story." And with that she picked up her needles again, the gentle clicking blending with the wind's whisper beyond the window pane, as the world of St. Mildred settled once more into its tranquil rhythm, its secrets for now safely at rest under the patient gaze of the woman who had always known that nothing in human nature ever truly ends, ever truly